The auditorium settled into a tense quiet as Alex and Jordan took their places beneath a banner that read, "Tariff Shock, Prices or Paychecks." Alex began with the steady cadence of someone used to schematics and shop floors. Tariffs, Alex argued, were not brick walls but adjustable valves, tools to repressurize an economy whose industrial lungs had thinned after decades of offshoring. The case opened with the geography of loss, shuttered machine shops in river towns, apprenticeship programs that vanished when foundries went dark, tax bases eroded until schools cut welding labs, and community colleges downsized precision manufacturing certificates. Cheap televisions and bargain appliances had masked a deeper expense, Alex said, the slow attrition of middle-wage work that knits communities together. A calibrated tariff paired with procurement guarantees and targeted credits could buy the time needed to retool plants, reshore certain components, and rebuild the skills pipeline. There would be price bumps, yes, but the claim was that today's modest increase at the checkout could translate into tomorrow's thicker paychecks and sturdier local economies. Alex distinguished between blanket protectionism and surgical triage. Concentrate on strategic nodes, semiconductors, batteries, solar inputs, critical minerals, where single country dependencies are dangerous while keeping competition alive in non-critical goods to discipline costs. The point, Alex emphasized, was not autarky but resilience. A nation should never be one cargo delay or geopolitical chill away from losing an industry. To preempt the familiar inflation critique, Alex outlined a sequencing plan, temporary tariffs set with sunset reviews, parallel investments in automation, cleanroom build-outs, and workforce pipelines, and transparency dashboards so the public could watch promised capacity actually appear. In this framing, tariffs were the tempo setter in a broader industrial strategy orchestra, not the entire song. Without that tempo, Alex said, capital would continue to chase the path of least resistance overseas, and the country would keep renting supply chains it ought to own. Jordan replied with the cool specificity of balance sheets and shipping ledgers. Tariffs do not rebuild, Jordan contended, they redistribute, and often regressively. The costs do not stay confined to targeted sectors, but seep into grocery aisles, hardware stores, and the maintenance budget of a small factory that suddenly pays 12% more for imported bearings. A 10% tariff rarely lands as a neat 10% at the register. It cascades through markups, hedging, and financing costs, raising end prices 15–20% in import-heavy categories. Retaliation is not a hypothetical. When the U.S. raises duties, partners answer, shrinking export markets for farmers, distillers, and parts makers who never asked to be combatants. Supply chains then contort into tariff, dodging Mays's paper subsidiaries, round, about shipping, country of origin, gymnastics, that add friction without creating a single new American job. If national security is the aim, Jordan argued, the better play is diversification with allies, mutual recognition of standards, trusted partner sourcing clubs, and shared stockpiles rather than walls that push friends to shop elsewhere. Instead of tariffs as first resort, Jordan outlined a cleaner stack, accelerated expensing for domestic equipment upgrades, grants for workforce upskilling in mechatronics and machining, streamlined siting and permitting for advanced fabs and battery plants, and direct, transparent subsidies where a public interest clearly exists. That mix, Jordan said, builds capacity without the hidden tax that tariffs levy on every family's refrigerator, phone, and pair of work boots. To the charge that laces, fare had hollowed towns, Jordan answered that place-based policies, logistics upgrades, and patient capital mattered more than across-the-board import taxes. That predictable rules attract investment better than trade volatility, and that, where strategic risk is real, narrow time, box safeguards beat broad duties that linger long after their ration. expires. The crux was time horizons. Alex sought immediate friction to buy rebuilding time, while Jordan warned that immediate friction compounds into medium-term drag on consumers, on exporters hit by retaliation, and on small manufacturers squeezed between pricier inputs and customers who refuse higher quotes. The exchange tightened as examples turned concrete, and numbers began to carry the room. Alex pivoted to case studies that felt tactile. The steel mill that restarted one blast furnace after a tariff gave it breathing room, the tool and die shop that hired apprentices when orders domestically sourced molds rebounded, the battery component maker that inked a purchase agreement with a Midwestern automaker once import prices inched up enough to make local bids pencil out. The logic was straightforward. Even a modest wedge of price protection could reshape investment calculus when paired with procurement certainty and tax incentives. Where Jordan saw tariff cascades, Alex asked the audience to consider the counterfactual cascade that had been a quiet norm for decades. Every time a firm offshored a subassembly, the capability to make the next, more sophisticated part eroded at home. Every time a skilled worker left a region because the plant closed, a future cohort lost its teacher. Every time a community college sunset a machining certificate for lack of employer partners, the pipeline kinked. Restoring those ladders required more than sentiment. It required a predictable price umbrella under which learning curves could steepen and yield could improve. Alex mapped a sequence. Year 1, a narrowly tailored tariff in a sector identified as strategically entangled. Year 2, procurement and tax credits trigger, apprenticeship seats double, and a federal state site readiness fund pays to pull utilities to empty industrial pads. Year 3, cost curves bend as factories reach volume, with the tariff reviewed against measurable domestic capacity. The word review mattered because it separated strategy from nostalgia. Alex promised an off-ramp contingent on actual gains, not vibes. In this vision, tariffs were bridges to a place that had to be built while crossing. Jordan refused to let the bridge metaphor stand without an engineer's inspection. Bridges must be rated for load, he argued, and too often tariffs were rated by press release. The examples came fast. When duties landed on intermediate inputs, sheet steel, fasteners, specialty chemicals, the very domestic manufacturers supposedly protected were squeezed first, long before a single new smelter or refinery could come online. A Midwestern HVAC maker faced a choice between raising prices on working families or eating margin it could not afford. A small electronics shop building hospital devices saw lead times stretch and component brokers flourish, adding cost without adding value. Then came retaliation. Soybeans that once sailed to a key market sat in silos. Whiskey exporters watched once. Friendly countries slap counter duties, and a maker of precision valves lost a foothold in a foreign public procurement contract when its government, annoyed, rewrote the fine print. Jordan emphasized pass-through dynamics. The first-order 10% tariff might sound manageable, but by the time it wound through global markups, logistics hedges, and financing buffers, the effective increase at the shelf could be significantly higher. When households face that pain, and lower-income households spend a larger share of income on tradable goods. The political coalition for sustained rebuilding frayed. Jordan's alternative path did not require surrender. It offered guardrails that felt less like a sledgehammer and more like a torque wrench. Rules of origin tightened against transshipment, surge safeguards deployed surgically with sunset clocks, allied sourcing club that lowered barriers among trusted partners while coordinating on external risks, direct, transparent production credits tied to verifiable output in strategic sectors, and a standing retaliation reserve, fund to cushion exporters when partners inevitably struck back. The advantage, Jordan argued, was legibility. A citizen could see the subsidy in a line item rather than guessing at its presence in pricier groceries. Alex countered that direct subsidies without price signals were like installing turbochargers on an engine with a clogged air filter. They helped, but only up to the constraint. Without a tariff, global suppliers could dump excess capacity at will, undercutting fledgling domestic lines before they could achieve scale. Tariffs, narrow, sunsetted, and paired with investment, cleared the lane long enough for productivity to catch up. To the input squeeze critique, Alex proposed tariff rate quotas and differentiated schedules. Keep duties low or zero on inputs not yet available domestically. Apply higher rates to finished goods that threaten to code, lock dependence, and publish schedules that step down as domestic output hits milestones. No one should pay learning tax forever, Alex said. The design principle was a temporary umbrella, not a permanent roof. The two briefly converged on enforcement, unusually for a debate of this temperature. Both agreed that if tariffs existed, they had to be paired with rigorous customs screening, data analytics to catch transshipment, and cooperation with partner nations to prevent pass-through. Relabeling otherwise honest firms would be undercut by cheaters, and the entire policy would fail its own premise. Where they diverged again was on risk assessment. Alex elevated the language of option value. Some domestic capabilities were worth paying to keep or rebuild because their absence multiplied vulnerability in eras of geopolitical stress. Chips, battery precursors, grid, scale transformers, critical minerals refining failures in these nodes were not equivalent to slightly dearer sneakers. Jordan didn't dispute strategic nodes. The objection was breadth and slippage. Once tariffs became a politically beloved tool, sectors lined up to claim strategic status, and the umbrella grew heavy, dampening competitive discipline. Jordan pressed for ex-ante criteria, clear thresholds for concentration risk, substitutability, and national security externalities, so that special pleading didn't turn strategy into pork. The back and forth drifted into the practicalities of workforce because both recognized factories were not just buildings, they were communities of practice. Alex highlighted union partnerships and higher, owed labor standards as part of the pitch. If the public was asked to absorb price pressure now, the return had to be visible in stable jobs with ladders, not precarious gigs. Jordan welcomed those standards, but asked what happened if domestic producers, sheltered by tariffs, skimped on innovation. Competition, Jordan said, was the mother of productivity. The trick was to keep its discipline without ceding the entire field. That was where an allied market could do more than a solo tariff, widen demand for high-standard goods, punish resta, the bottom practices collectively, and build redundancy that blunted anyone's country's leverage. In closing this round, Alex returned to first principles. Resilience costs something, but fragility costs more when the bill arrives. Jordan nodded fragility was a tax, yes, but insisted the bill be paid cleanly, transparently, with tools that minimized collateral harm. The room did not split along neat lines. It tilted back and forth as each example landed, proof that the difference here was not between care and indifference, but between two ways of purchasing security, one with price walls to carve a safe harbor for rebuilding, the other with precision instruments and alliances to shape flows without blanketing the landscape in tariffs. The debate widened from economics to the politics that govern what is possible, because any blueprint that ignores elections, coalitions, and public patience is a schematic for a machine that will never be built. Alex acknowledged the political gravity. Tariffs pulled well in communities that had lived through plant closures, and they offered a visible, graspable lever that signaled seriousness. Policy that could be explained at a town hall. We will protect this sector for 3 years while we build capacity, and here is the milestone chart. Had a communicative advantage over pages of arcane subsidy rules. That communicative clarity was an asset, Alex argued, not a gimmick. It could be weaponized for accountability. Publish quarterly dashboards showing how many apprenticeship seats were filled, how many tooling lines came online, how domestic share in a target product rose, and how tariff rates stepped down as promised. Tie the tariff to performance bonds. If a firm took shelter but didn't add capacity or jobs, claw back benefits through surtaxes or procurement penalties. Link the policy to community benefits agreements so that a revived factory participated in local training, daycare support, and transportation planning. Tariffs in this telling were not handouts. They were contracts with the public, enforceable and reversible. Alex urged reframing. Rather than asking households to pay more, ask what they were buying: shorter supply chains that failed less often, emergency stockpiles that didn't evaporate during crises, and jobs that steadied mortgage payments and kept schools open. Politics could carry this if the milestones were clean and the off-ramps real. Jordan accepted the need for narrative but warned against the theater that often follows. Once tariffs entered the bloodstream, they tended to stick not because they still served the public interest, but because beneficiaries organized to preserve them. Sunset clauses were nice in theory. In practice, every sunset sprouted a lobbying campaign for an extension, often under the banner of security. The political economy shifted from building competitive muscle to protecting margins. Jordan's answer was to design friction against permanence. Independent review boards with statutory authority to lift tariffs absent hard evidence of ongoing risk. Automatic rate declines keyed to domestic cost curves and capacity audits, and a household's first rebate mechanism that returned a portion of tariff revenue as lump sum credits, cushioning low and middle income families against regressivity and making it politically palatable to let duties lapse when promises were kept. Jordan stressed coalition breadth. Exporters, farmers, aircraft suppliers, services firms had to be inside the tent from day one, not after the first retaliatory volley. Cities that received newcomers when factories reopened needed housing, transit, and school funding plans that preempted backlash. Environmental groups needed credible guardrails so that reindustrialization did not become an alibi for dirty shortcuts. And allies needed visibility into U.S. timelines so their own politics could absorb coordination without handing ammunition to protectionists abroad. Tariffs done in a vacuum fractured these coalitions. Targeted safeguards embedded in allied frameworks strengthened them. Alex pushed back with a discussion of sequencing. Get the muscle on bone first, then remove the cast. Without initial shelter, the muscle might never regrow. The cast metaphor, however, carried a risk that Jordan seized. Casts can atrophy limbs if they stay on too long. Hence, Jordan said, the emphasis on discipline, public ledgers that name who pays, who benefits, and when the brace comes off. He proposed a tariff ledger, printed alongside the quarterly dashboards Alex favored. Incidence by income decile, sectoral price impacts, retaliation exposure by state, and the share of revenues recycled to households in training funds make the trade offs legible and the politics more honest. Alex, seeing room for synthesis, agreed on transparency, but insisted that ledger entries include counterfactual losses avoided, downtime averted in hospitals because transformer imports weren't a bottleneck, farm equipment shipments that weren't delayed because a domestic casting supplier existed within trucking distance, emergency procurement that didn't have to pay cartel markups during a shock. The public deserved both sides of the ledger, not only costs incurred, but fragility avoided. The conversation turned to enforcement and fairness, where both saw the stakes for legitimacy. Alex emphasized that tariffs without strong enforcement were invitations to cheats who relabeled goods or threaded shipments through tariff-free nodes. Jordan added that over-enforcement at ports' random holdups of legitimate imports could be its own tax, snarling supply chains and favoring giants with compliance armies. The balanced remedy looked almost technocratic. Modernized customs ID risk-based targeting, information sharing with partners to flag suspicious flows, and stiff penalties for transshipment that outweighed the gains. Here, both agreed that if tariffs existed at all, they had to be smart or they would be self-sabotage. The debate also surfaced equity. Alex refused a model that rebuilt factories while reproducing historical exclusions. Tariffs had to be braided with workforce pathways that pulled in women, veterans, and communities of color with wraparound support, child care, transit, paid training that turned opportunity into uptake. Jordan concurred on equity, but worried that price pressure fell hardest on those same households if rebates and targeted relief were not automatic and timely. A household's first circuit breaker, he argued, should be statutory and earn income boost or energy credit that scaled with measured tariff incidence, so that the politics of care were built in rather than improvised. Finally, the international frame returned, but with more texture than slogans. Alex described a two-tier world, an inner ring of trusted partners who agreed on labor and environmental floors, shared data to police transshipment, and coordinated on targeted safeguards, and outer ring where duties reflected real security risks or anti-competitive practices. Jordan supported the inner ring but warned that shouting friend, shoring, while slapping allies with surprise, tariffs was a recipe for cynicism. If the U.S. wanted a club, it had to treat members like members, predictable rules, dispute resolution, and votes that reflected mutual commitments. The politics, both conceded, would be messy. Any plan that touches prices and paychecks always is. But the mess could be navigated if the architecture was built so voters saw promises kept on a schedule and felt cushioning when costs arrived. The choice before the country was not simply tariffs or not, but which mix of tools with which guardrails, in service of which measurable ends, a political sentence long enough to be true and clear enough to win. Closing moves sharpened into criteria. Because durable policy needs a checklist the public can hold up next month and next year. Alex offered 5 tests for any tariff used in the name of resilience. First, strategic specificity. Duties must target nodes where concentration risk, substitutability, and national security externalities are independently verified. Chips, grid transformers, critical mineral refining rather than serving as general mood lighting. Second, paired investments. Every tariff dollar collected should trigger at least $1 in transparent domestic capacity, building apprenticeships, equipment upgrades, site prep, permitting fast lanes, with public dashboards clocking progress against dated milestones. Third, step-down schedules. Rates decline automatically as domestic output hits cost and volume thresholds, with an independent board empowered to accelerate the off-ramp if firms underperform or extend narrowly if shocks persist. Fourth, input protection. Tariff freight quotas or zero rates for inputs not yet available domestically, preventing the very firms being helped from suffocating on cost. Fifth, households, first rebates. A portion of revenue returned as lump, some credits to cushion regressivity, accompanied by price, impact reporting by income decile, so trade offs are not hidden in receipts. If these tests were met, Alex argued, the country could buy time without buying complacency and could make a down payment on a supply base that paid itself back in reliability when storms, literal or geopolitical, hit. Jordan answered with mirror tests designed to catch drift. 1. Counterfactual clarity. Before imposing any duty, publish the alternative tool considered subsidy, stockpile, allied sourcing, standards, and show why tariff performance dominates when measured against price, impact, timeline, and enforceability. 2. Retaliation readiness. Identify export sectors by state that could be targeted and stand up a pre-funded cushion so communities are not collateral damage. 3. Measurement discipline. Require incidence tables, supply chain mapping updates, and household rebate flows in the same quarterly report. Alex described sunlight that makes it harder for temporary measures to become permanent habits. 4. Alliance integrity. Bind any tariff in sensitive sectors to a compact with allies' shared thresholds, shared surveillance against dumping, shared off-ramps, so that security does not become code for solo. 5. Innovation check. Subject protected sectors to performance audits on productivity, energy efficiency, and emissions. If shelter yields fat but no muscle, the shelter comes down. Jordan also returned to a point that resonated with small business owners: predictability. Whether the policy mix leaned tariff, heavy, or subsidy, heavy, firms needed to know the rules of the game for 5 to 10 years to justify capital expenditure. Whiplashim, pose, lift, reimpose destroyed the very investment appetite the debate hoped to provoke. The final minutes edged toward synthesis that neither tried to paper over differences nor surrendered to stalemate. There was agreement that some capabilities are worth paying to keep. The disagreement was over how long, and how broadly. There was agreement that enforcement must be sharp and fair. Disagreement over the balance between port vigilance and trade fluidity. There was agreement that households should not carry the heaviest pack. Disagreement over whether rebates plus transparency could neutralize regressivity enough to justify duties. A sketched hybrid emerged almost despite the combat, a narrow criteria-driven tariff perimeter around truly strategic nodes embedded in an allied framework, paired with direct production credit and procurement that put demand behind domestic lines and shot through with automatic sunsets, independent audits, and household rebates. Outside that perimeter, the toolkit would favor open trade, standards, based clubs, and targeted safeguards for surges and cheating. Both emphasize the cultural piece that turns tools into outcomes, workforce dignity and inclusion, clean permitting reform so made here, isn't crushed by process, public dashboards that make citizens co-auditors rather than spectators, and after-action reports whenever shocks hit, naming what broke, what held, and what will be fixed by a date not far away. The closing images were not of winners and losers, but of clocks and ledgers. Clocks because time is the scarcest input time to train a welder, to stand up a cathode line, to certify a new grid transformer, to negotiate return flows with allies so retaliation is minimized and cooperation maximized. Ledgers because hidden costs corrode trust. If prices rise for a season, voters should see where the money went into equipment on factory floors, into apprenticeships and childcare at training centers, into grid upgrades and port scanners that bust transshipment schemes, into rebates that land in bank accounts rather than slogans. Alex's last point returned to resilience as insurance. Premiums look expensive until the day after the storm, when everyone asks why they were so low. Jordan's last point returned to discipline. Insurance worth paying for is priced, targeted, and sunsetted when risk falls. Anything else is a slush fund with a flag draped over it. Between those poles lay the work of self-government, choosing tools, measuring results, absorbing short-term discomfort only when the map to a better medium-term is legible and credible. The applause at the end carried a different tone than the hush at the start, not closure, exactly, but readiness. The audience had been handed not a slogan, but a set of dials. Which ones the country turns and how steadily will decide whether tariff shock. becomes a bruise we nurse or a bridge we cross, whether prices inch up without purpose or paychecks thicken because a nation built, carefully, transparently, and together, the capacity it wants to rely on when the seas get rough.